Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today in this room and worldwide through YouTube. My name is Elad Lapidot. I'm a professor for Jewish Studies at the University of Lille in France, and I am a co-director of what we call the Berlin Center for Intellectual Diaspora, a project that I'm running together with other colleagues. Stefan Steiner is here with us today, a project that is based at here the Katholische Akademie in Berlin. The idea of this program, the Center for Diaspora or Intellectual Diaspora, is of a Edward Said inspiration, looking at the place of critical thinking as being part of a society, but a little detached, a little at a distance, a little diasporic or exilic. And what we try to do here is create a space where we give space to different events, conferences, workshop, talks, book talks that address matters of broader social, cultural interest in the meeting point between religion, culture, politics, and society. We work on different themes. And all this said, at the basis of this initiative stands a project, a conversation between Jewish and Christian, or more specifically Jewish and Catholic intellectuals that take the conversation between these traditions as a certain inspiration for the understanding of what we try to do here. So there is perhaps no better book that has appeared in the last years that speaks so directly to the, let's say, undercurrents of this entire program as the book that we're going to discuss this evening, Jacob's younger brother. And I'm very happy to have here with us the author, a close friend and a great scholar, Karma Ben-Johanan from Jerusalem. The author of the book is here with us today to discuss together with two other guests. And I will begin by presenting Karma and our two guests and tell you something about the book, something about what is in the book and out the book. And then we're going to move to a series of interventions and talks. Karma will tell us something about the book itself, and then Christian and Axel, that I will immediately present to you, will give their perspective, after which we'll have a conversation that will open to a broader discussion with your questions. So you have the time to ask your questions. So as said, I will start by presenting our guests. So first, Kalata Simcha. Karma Ben-Johanan, as I said, teaches at the Department of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She completed her PhD in the School of Historical Studies at the Tel Aviv University. Subsequently, she was a Fulbright postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, and a postdoctoral fellow at the Polonsky Academy for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences in the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. In 2019, she was appointed the first chair of Jewish-Christian relations in the Faculty of Theology at the Humboldt University zu Berlin, where she served until the summer of 2022, last year. And then she left us back to Jerusalem. Her first book, here on the table, Jacob's Younger Brother, Christian-Jewish Relations After Vatican II, this is the title of our evening, received a very prestigious prize, the Dan David Prize, the world's largest prize in history. It also won many other prizes, such as the Shazar Prize, the Polonsky Prize. So many people already read and liked the book. This is what he got the prize for. Christian Rutishauser, a Jesuit delegate for schools and higher education of the Central European province of the Jesuits, studied theology and philosophy at the Fribourg Universität, followed by doctoral studies at Lucerne University, studied also in Jerusalem at Ratisbon, and is running programs and teaching in different universities in Switzerland, in Germany, and in Jerusalem. He is a current member of the Swiss and German Episcopal Conference Commissions for the Dialogue with Judaism. He's a permanent counselor of the Holy See for the religious relations with Judaism since 2014. And some of his more recent publications include Christsein im Angesicht des Judentums, 2008, The Human Condition and the Thought of Rabbi Josef Soloveitchik from 2013, and more recently, Christlichen Glauben denken im Dialog mit der jüdischen Tradition, 2016. And our third participant this evening, Axel Turner, a pastor, is the representative for Christian-Jewish dialogue in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Bavaria at the Institute for Christian-Jewish Studies and Relations at Augustana Divinity School. He studied Protestant theology and Jewish studies in Erlangen, Kiel, and Jerusalem. And in his doctoral thesis, he dealt with the Aria paragraph and the Bavarian pastor families with Jewish ancestors in the Third Reich. With Wolfgang Kraus and Michael Tilly, he co-edited Das Neue Testament Jüdisch erklärt. So we have the right people here on the stage to discuss all the different issues that this book raises. And as I said, I will say a small thing about what is in the book and a small thing about to get the book. What is in the book is especially interesting for our program because we try not only to bring into conversation different traditions, religious or not, but more specifically into a disagreement, into a dialogue that also shows the differences. And I think Karma's book makes a very good job in doing precisely this, showing disagreements even in the agreement, showing how reconciliation itself can be a matter of contestation. And agreement is not enough. You have to agree about the agreement, whether there was an agreement or there was no agreement. We'll hear more about that in a second. As about how you get the book, you will find flyers on your way out on this table on the right, where you will have a code. And if you want, if you're convinced after this talk that you want to read the book, then you can go on the website of the editor, the Harvard University Press. You can use the code and you will get a substantial reduction on your book. And now, with not much further ado, I will invite Karma to talk to us.
So I'll just start by, before I thank you, I'll just start by saying how wonderful it is to have a room full of so many people that are very close to my heart. So thank you all for coming. And Elad, thank you so much for the invitation. It is so good to be here in Berlin, and especially here, the Center of Intellectual Diaspora, Katholische Akademie. I'm really very, very excited. You will probably feel this also when I speak about the book. And thank you so much, dear friends, for coming. Christian and Axel for accepting the invitation. And thank you, Stefan, for having me here too. And former students and colleagues and everyone else, and also those whom I don't know and very happy to meet for the first time. So I thought about starting with explaining perhaps why I wrote the book, and then telling you very briefly about the subject matter, the issues that are in it. And I know that I'm supposed to speak for 15 to 20 minutes, but perhaps it will be a little less, because for me, of course, the interesting thing would be to discuss it. Okay, so let's start. As we all know, we are living in an age of Jewish-Christian dialogue, of interreligious dialogue in general, but of Jewish-Christian dialogue in particular. And we usually speak about this era as an era that put 2 millennia of hostility into the trash heap of history, right? A whole new realm, a new age, a new time, and all the very the tense relationships that we've known within the Jewish-Christian realm for a very long time is now seen as something that is resolved. And of course, as historians, we have to be suspicious when these sort of narratives come up that divide very, very clearly between the past and the present. Medievalists always say that it's unfair to talk about modernity, and because many things that we talk about when we talk about modernity, we already have in the Middle Ages and so forth. So it's always very complicated, and I suspected that also this concept of Jewish-Christian dialogue and reconciliation might be more complex than what we usually think. This is, from the outset, I'll just say that it doesn't mean that there is nothing new. Of course, there is something very significant that is new, but somehow in order to understand the new, perhaps we should complicate the narrative a little bit. And this is what I tried to do in the book, because it seems to be that there are several open questions. And since the book focuses, I'll already say that, on 2 specific communities and their theological dealings with the other community. This is the Roman Catholic community and the Jewish Orthodox community. And perhaps we can speak about why I chose these specific communities later. I think there is much to say about other communities as well, especially after teaching at the Faculty of Theology at Humboldt. And I hope to do this in my next steps in my thinking about these issues. So within the Catholic community, it seemed that one of the main questions would be how the relationship with Jews is connected with other topics, such as the post-Vatican II debate on the reception of the Council and the interpretation of the Council, such as the relationship with liberal democracies and various other topics which are debated within the Catholic intellectual community. So it seemed that it could be interesting to look at dialogue also from that perspective. And another issue, perhaps broader, was when we talk about reconciliation or dialogue, what is the language of this dialogue? How can we frame this dialogue? If this is something that is so totally new, then of course there is a large amount of creativity invested in thinking how to move this forward, how to find a language, how to tell a new story about Jewish-Christian relations. And when we talk about new things, of course, there are powers that push towards different directions. And therefore, we can also assume that there are debates. And it goes back to your wonderful introduction about the agreement on agreement, right? Or the disagreement on how to agree. And so there are some losers and some winners in terms of how the dialogue is framed, and this is on both sides. Of course, there's the question of how do these communities deal with some very hard sources and very central sources within their traditions? How do they reinterpret? Do they have similar strategies? Or not. And this brings me to the main question, of course, the question of symmetry, and whether, when we talk about dialogue, this means that the partners speak at all in the same language, the same religious language, and we can already think that when we talk about orthodoxy, the main language that Orthodox rabbis and scholars speak is the halachic language more than anything else. While when we talk about Catholics, we talk about theology, which behaves very differently than what we know of the Jewish side. But when we talk about Jews, there is something even more central or preliminary that we should discuss first. And this is that when we talk about Jewish-Christian dialogue, we usually think about what the Christian side has done after the Holocaust, right? We know that the change was needed there because of what has happened. This is the central impetus, the central incentive for change was this change of heart within Christian communities, not only Catholic communities, but of course Nostra Aetate and its trajectory is incredibly central in the ecumenical world in general as well. But what about Jews? What did they think about the whole process, and whether they had the same incentives to reconcile, to enter into dialogue? Why should Jews enter into dialogue with Christians? What do they want to gain from this? And I'm not talking instrumentally, also spiritually and intellectually, but why should they? And certainly it's not the same goals than we have on the Christian side. So part of my idea was that somehow when we look at dialogue, it seems that Jews just hopped on the wagon of reconciliation, so to say, somehow in a very passive form. So the Christians were the ones who were anti-Jewish. They had they had problems with Jews, and Jews somehow passively, they had to deal with it, but it's not that they had their own categories, intellectual dealings with Christians from the outset, but they responded. They responded to Christian persecution, to Christian anti-Judaism, and when Christians wanted to reconcile, they also responded in kind and were willing to enter into dialogue. There is something very passive about this idea. So one of the central questions was whether there is also a construction of a Christian within Judaism, and how this construction looks like, again, without looking for symmetry. Symmetry in Jewish-Christian relations, of course, is never it's never there. So these were the questions, and this meant, to a certain degree, deconstructing dialogue, again, without undermining the achievements of dialogue or the concept. The more I study it, the more it seems to me that something real and important has happened, but still the construction can be sobering and important, I think, both academically and intellectually, but also in terms of the actual dialogue and relationship between the communities. So my focus was on surfacing the awkwardness, the polemical aspects, the parts of instrumentalizations of the other that we sense in each of the communities, the way that some theologians or rabbis try to circumvent what really hurts and is difficult within this relationship, and at times also, sheer aggressiveness. This is also part of what's going on today in the era of reconciliation, which brings us to a very, it's not that nothing is happening in Israel at the moment, but we don't have to get into that. But of course, I do think it's related. Okay, so how much time do I have? A few minutes left, because I wanted to be short, but now I see that I'm not, because it's a whole book and I can tell you a lot about it. So maybe I'll just give two very brief examples of the sort of things that are dealt with in the book. One would be perhaps a very basic, a very famous gesture of John Paul II, when Pope John Paul II, when he visited the Great Synagogue of Rome in 1986. And he's saying there, you are our dearly beloved brothers, and in a certain way, it could be said that you are our elder brothers. And still, when you go, right, when you visit Rome, you go to Italy, you always hear this, oh, elder brothers. I mean, as a Jew, this is what you hear sometimes when you encounter Catholics there. But when we think in terms of our traditions, of course, elder brothers is not a compliment, to say the least, right? And so the heart of the competition, of the old competition between Jews and Christians, was typologically inserted into these categories of elder and younger brothers. This is also where the name of the book came from. And it doesn't mean that John Paul II meant to say something offensive. I don't think this is the case at all. And I think also the context in which he presents these ideas changes the meaning of this sentence. But there is something that, the spirit of polemic, of Jewish-Christian polemic throughout the ages is kind of haunting this, also the very positive instances of contemporary Jewish-Christian dialogue. This is what's so interesting about it. I deal a lot with John Paul II and the way he uses gestures precisely in order to reformulate the hard theological questions, but not always while really addressing them. So this is maybe the part that was received in the least positive way, I think. But we can talk about this later. And on the Jewish side, I'll give another example, which is also has very much to do with the Catholic tradition. As we know, there was heavy censorship on rabbinic texts for centuries, and the Jewish communities were adjusted to just reading these censored texts. This is the versions of the Talmud, of Maimonides, many parts of liturgy, of prayers are censored. This is the consensus within the Jewish world is to use these censored versions. But when we talk about a time when the Jewish-Christian tension no longer exists and when Jews no longer live under a Christian rule, and when there is religious freedom and extensive rights to Jews, and there's also the State of Israel, so we see that the Jewish rabbinic communities are also invested in taking off censorship and in recovering the texts that were in their originals. And also rabbinic communities, you wouldn't expect it because it's really methodologies of historians, but they compare versions and they look for ways to recover the original texts. But of course, the original texts do contain also offensive parts towards Christians. So there is something a bit paradoxical about it, that precisely the ability to be free to discuss things and that there is no longer a Christian pressure on Jews that expresses itself in rabbinic literature, then Jews are also free to surface the places in their traditions that are actually antagonistic towards Christians and Christianity. And this paradoxical aspect of Jewish-Christian dialogue and reconciliation is really the center of the book. So just to conclude, what else is very important that I say here is that, okay, so it seems like these are very different processes, and indeed, on many levels, they are very different from each other. But there is, of course, also a historical setting that connects between these communities. Both communities, when they think about their relationship, they are also thinking about them in a world where Jews no longer live under Christian rule. That's central. Both communities have to deal with liberal democracies, now also with the crisis of liberalism, of course, and this is interesting in its own right, what this does to dialogue. This is not in the book, but certainly interesting. And both try to recover all kinds of pasts. So, of course, we all know, as people who know a little bit the dynamics of Jewish-Christian dialogue, the Christian part is very much invested in rereading the New Testament, reading it within the Jewish context, right? This is a very central theme going back to some kind of an original symbiosis between the communities before they were disconnected from each other, right, before the parting of the ways. Well, what we see in rabbinic communities is actually also a return, but an attempt to return to a time when Judaism was free of Christian pressure. So something that is the exact opposite of symbiosis, which is also, I think, extremely interesting, how the different communities, their theologies respond to very similar historical processes, but in completely different ways. Okay, so I think that's enough for us as a starting point, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing my colleagues here.
Shall I go ahead or you? Go ahead. Kammer, thanks so much. I think you gave and give with your book really a great challenge to dialogue and just to break up two easy patterns of the relationship of Jews and Christians. And even when I read the first time the title of your book, it really irritated me. Jacob's younger brother. Who is, by the hell, Jacob's younger brother? He has only an older brother, and that's Esau. He's the firstborn. Then I read the subtitle, Jewish-Christian Relations after Vatican II. It's very clearly, do you allude to Jacob and Esau? Are we still in the traditional find, and are they really the enemy twins? And I was reflecting upon this, and then I said it cannot refer to it, even before I read the book. And I said you have to really refer to Jacob and Esau beyond the traditional dichotomy of the rabbinic pattern, Jacob and Esau. And then I said you can only refer to the metaphor of the siblings, Jews and Christians, as two twin traditions coming out of the biblical tradition, as it is very often used, the metaphors nowadays. But when you refer to Judaism as Jacob, and in the title of the book you speak of brother, you really evoke the association of Esau. And therefore, I can only read the title as a synopsis of two brothers who are no longer enemies in the traditional sense, but what's the new situation? And did they become friends? So that was my first question I had when I saw the title, and when I read the book, I could really see that's not the case. And you make it just more complex. And even when I was reflecting on your title, who is so subtle and who needs really interpretation, I said, I'm really enjoying to read this book. So just think about the title here. I won't take two parts and make a remark on the first part, on the Christian side, and then a second remark on the second part of the book on the Jewish theology on Christianity. As you said, you concentrated on Jewish-Catholic dialogue in the first part. And you discussed John Paul II and Benedict XVI, both of who were shaped very differently by the history of the 20th century. That means by National Socialism and the Shoah, one as a Pole and the other as a German. And then you impressively described the two popes' different styles of approaching dialogue with the Jews. John Paul, the charismatic church politician, set signs and built trust between Jews and the church through visits to the Roman synagogue, to Auschwitz, and to Israel. And he slowly, and I think you show it like this, instinctively felt his way toward a renewed theology of Judaism, which had really to find its form after Nostra Aetate. But above all, keywords such as God's unrevoked covenant with his people will occupy a whole generation of theologians. That's John Paul II. and then Benedict XVI, really quite different, as you depict him. He's the systematic theologian. He wanted to emphasize the continuity of dogmatic tradition even beyond the council, and the church cannot have only erred in the past, even vis-à-vis Judaism. Above all, Benedict tries to save Catholic identity through detailed theological questions in the face of postmodern relativism, of subjectivism, and forgetfulness of the truth. In doing so, and you show it very clearly, often unintentionally, he offended the Jews. Sensitivity for the Jewish dialogue partner was lacking. Collateral damage must be dealt with again and again. Karma, you describe and analyze the two pontificates and their relations with Judaism more accurately than so many Catholic theologians. I'm so grateful that your outside view on both of them opens new windows, and you describe the contemporary historical context. For me, it was, for example, very impressive how you elaborate the two phases in the pontificate of John Paul II. I have never seen an analyst like this. At the time of the Cold War, he was fighting for the recognition of the suffering also of the Polish people in Auschwitz. And this brought him into conflict with Jewish culture of remembrance. Theologically, he tended to capture Judaism, you already said it, well-intentioned and in a benevolent way, but it is really a capturing of Judaism and not of letting Judaism be free in the self-definition. And then in a second phase, I was just speaking of John Paul II, I and John Paul II, II, like Wittgenstein I and Wittgenstein II. In that sense, because you show how he developed, and in the new position in the 90s after the Cold War, he really tried to understand Judaism in himself, definition, and also went on to create and establish diplomatic relationships with the State of Israel, a forgiveness of the Church for the contribution to the Shoah, and so on. So I was really thrilled by your analysis, especially in this context. However, and you know, I want to criticize you in one point, and you mentioned it already, we were already on debates and different contexts. You assume that John Paul II has worked through communicative skills and symbolic gestures, mostly or only, but having avoided difficult theological dogmatic questions. To this, it must be said that the Pope, first and foremost, he's not a theologian. Benedict was one, but that's not the role of a Pope to be first and foremost a theologian. In addition, his symbolic gestures, I think, must really have been read as performative theology. So, and what does it mean, performative theology? For the Jewish Christian dialogue, it seems to me interesting that the gestures and symbolic acts with which John Paul II shaped the dialogue are to a significant extent in the liturgical, ritual realm. The visit to the synagogue in Rome, the prayer at the Western Wall, and a commemoration in the Tent of Remembrance in Yad Vashem. He always shapes sacred spaces. During the visit to Israel, the prayer for forgiveness for Catholic anti-Judaism, already pronounced in the liturgy of repentance in St. Peter's Basilica, played a central role. This performative theology for him is therefore, above all, ritual performance and prayer. The distinction theological versus symbolic ritual we have just when we compare, and when you compare Benedict XVI and John Paul II, is hardly perceived in Jewish Christian dialogue. It is obscured by the distinction theological versus social cultural, which has been established by Rav Soloveitchik in his essay Confrontation in '64. So his position, yes, to dialogue with the church in the social, societal, and cultural spheres, especially in order to represent Jews and Christian interests vis-à-vis secular society, but no to a theological dialogue between church and orthodoxy. That's the pattern, not only coming from the Jewish side, but from the Jewish, not only from the Christian side, but from the Jewish Orthodox side. This reserve vis-à-vis theological systematic dialogue from the Jewish side, which always seems somehow alien to Judaism, as you wrote in the book yourself, has shaped the dialogue between the Church and Jewish Orthodoxy. The fact that John Paul II put dogmatic theological dialogue on the back burner is therefore not only to be derived from inner Catholic dispute and differences, but against this background, it is all the more surprising to note that it was precisely John Paul II's symbolic gestures of liturgical and ritual gestures that were able to greatly improve Jewish-Christian relations also to the Orthodox Jewish side. So that's just one point I really like to discuss with you and with the public on the relationship of symbolic gestures, ritual and prayer in dialogue versus the theological dialogue. That's one point, and thanks again for this analysis of Jewish Catholic dialogue. I'm very involved in, and I'm really thankful to you. I want to make a second point, because you really went into the Jewish theology of Christianity, and for me it's so important. I just see that is not so known here in Germany and in Europe. You presented the Jewish view of Christianity, and thereby valuable for us is not so much your a presentation of North American theology. I think that's more or less known also here in Europe, but what is very interesting for us is really to see how you analyze theology of Christianity as it has developed under the condition of Zionism. Just this literature, because written in Ivrit, I think that's one of the reasons why it's not so well perceived here in Europe. If I understood your main thesis, so I would try to bring it to the point. The Church's turning point away from anti-Judaism and their renewed and positive theology of Judaism on the one hand, and the Zionist solution for Judaism beyond a Christian majority society, that means Judaism in its own state and society with its sovereignty of self-definition and not defined by Christian minority, on the other side, has not led to Jewish theology judging Christianity positively and being open to dialogue. The context of a secular pluralistic society in North America, Europe, and Israel could lead to expect a tolerant dialogical Jewish theology also in Israel. But you show us that the new sovereignty and freedom led the Jewish thinkers speaking out freely about Christianity, and they finally dare to say what they really think, the Jewish side, on one hand. Christianity, for them, or for some of them, is an inferior form of religion, if not idolatry. Dialogue is not desirable for them. Some of the patterns of Christian anti-Judaism are even so deeply rooted in Jewish theology that they are projected back onto Christianity in an inverted form. I think that's a very interesting analysis you make. Thus, the book presents halakhic arguments as to whether Christianity must be considered idolatry or not. The question is discussed whether Christians are allowed to make a shittuf, an addition to God, may it be in the land of Israel or only in the diaspora. All these different aspects very often not into our minds. Then there is an inner Jewish debate based on Maimonides, whether Christianity should be criticized or not. And there the argument, are the Christians still the minority and could harm Christianity? Even if in the Israeli society we are the majority, but worldwide it could harm us. When I see all this debate, do these Jewish circles within Israel see the change in Christian theology in North America or Europe, or do they ignore it? Mm-hmm. So these are the interesting questions for me. Interesting then is above all your analysis of the Jewish national religious movement. So the theology shaped by father and son Cook and the French school of intellectuals, because they not only say that Christianity is a diluted monotheism or something like this, but that it really negated the vocation of Judaism vis-à-vis the nation and shaped in entirely a kind of worldview that is an obstacle to the self-definition of Judaism. When I read how you presented, for example, Leon Yehuda Ashkenazi, and how he studied La Nouvelle Théologie in French, I didn't know that he later then was and is now in the movement of the cookies, if I may to say so, and that just he sees that the crisis of the church and Christianity in Europe is a crisis because Judaism went back to the Ba'aretz, into the land, and not so only because of the Shoah, and Christianity did not really defend its values, but just because the Judaism in diaspora is so much part of Christian truth and the counter proof for Christian truth, and so that he sees that especially the Zionist project is one of the factors of the crisis of Christianity in Western Europe. Do we Christians see it like this? Do we go into debate with such a theology of Ashkenazi? So, in a nutshell, Karma, you present Jewish debates and argumentations on Christian which are just ignored here in Europe and in Germany. After reading your book, I see inner Christian debates, inner Jewish conversations. They are not in dialogue with each other. They seem disconnected. And in addition, you show that various Jewish Orthodox currents really are against dialogue on an equal footing and in a very open and straight way. So the book for me questions Jewish-Christian dialogue here in Europe. Is it too parochial and not reaching out to Israel? Is the Christian outlook on dialogue too simplistic, too ironic, too naive, what we are doing here? Is it caught in the perpetrator-victim dichotomy without realizing theological debates framed by other social contexts like Israel? And is Judaism really perceived in its real religious diversity and autonomy when we talk from the Christian side on Judaism? Your book brings definitely to mind how strongly every dialogue is shaped by the social and historical context. And they are quite different here in Germany, in Switzerland, where I'm coming from, in Israel, and in the United States, and in France. And that's the great contribution for dialogue here in Germany, in my opinion. And that's the reason why it made me reflect on a meta level what dialogue means here in Europe, and that's the reason why I hope that so many people are just reading your book and it will shape our dialogue here in Europe and Germany, at least within 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Christian, please, Axel.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this presentation and talk. I feel very honored and that I can contribute some thoughts to which I was inspired by your book, Karma. I do that with a particular perspective. I'm neither a Roman Catholic, nor a Jew, nor an Israeli citizen. So it was very interesting and fascinating to read your brilliant study with its many insights in traditions that are not mine. I'm a Lutheran pastor from Bavaria who is engaged in dialogue, so something different. Despite the fact that you focused on the Roman Catholic Church, I feel addressed in many ways and confronted with my tradition as well while reading your book. Different perceptions of Christianity by Jewish thinkers that you present do challenge me as a Lutheran Christian in the same way. Besides, I'm in dialogue with Roman Catholic Christians and theologians as well as with Jews, both liberal and Orthodox. But the material that you present are contexts to my understanding and perception of the relationship between Jews and Christians as well. It is extremely useful to read these sources in English. For me, my Hebrew is so awful, it would take me an hour just to read one passage. So I'm so grateful that you provide me with this wonderful, interesting material. I compared what I read about Roman Catholic and Orthodox Jewish voices with my experiences in Protestant churches and among Protestant dialogue partners. And I compared it too with my experiences with Jewish dialogue partners from various backgrounds. I see, you mentioned already, differences between the Jews in Germany and the Israeli Jews. Maybe my dialogue experiences with Israeli Orthodox Jews are different because I only meet with those who are interested in dialogue. They might know little about contemporary Christianity and the role of the churches in Germany today, but they are open to dialogue and exchange with a Christian theologian and, moreover, with a German. I value that even more after my reading of your book. If it comes to the Roman Catholic Church, I see analogies and differences. It's my personal approach, and I will focus mainly on the major Protestant churches, especially in Germany, meaning the Evangelische Kirche in Deutschland and its member churches. That means I won't focus particularly on the Freikirchen, on fundamentalist, conservative, evangelical or Pentecostal churches, or on Orthodox churches. My knowledge here is too small. So then, what do we have in common, both Catholic and Protestant? Since 1945, both churches issued on various levels and circles, sometimes, but rarely ecumenically, a lot of declarations. Those declarations contain the commitment to fight against anti-Semitism and to change teachings and preachings concerning Jews and Judaism in past and present, and to overcome the traditional supersession theology and anti-Jewish stereotypes as misleading and wrong. They also try to describe the Jewish-Christian relation in new terms and theological fundamentals. The covenant that was never revoked, or the ongoing election of Israel as God's own people, the validity of the promises to the patriarchs, and so on. More recently, the declarations also value the Jewish reading of the Tanakh for the Christian understanding of the Old Testament. Bible scholars and historians, both Christian and Jewish, with different affiliations, cooperate nowadays probably more intensely than ever. There is another communality after all the efforts that scholars, pastors, priests, teachers, and engaged parishioners have made in the last decades in their various contexts. Insofar, empirical research in Germany asks for the religious affiliation of the interviewed persons. It shows anti-Jewish attitudes are found in the whole population. There are only little differences between Catholics, Protestants, and people who do not consider themselves as religious or Christian. On the other hand, Christian-coined stereotypes are widespread in the general population, and some of them have secularized. So, we do have a problem with long-lasting, deeply rooted convictions, despite all the efforts. And we have it in all churches as well. We have it overtly, we have it subtle, we have it unconsciously, we have it among our church members, we have it among our theologians and teachers. Things do have changed in Jewish-Christian relations, and yes, there's a lot that has become better since 1945, but we do have problems. We do have unease, we do have trauma, we do have shame. This is a thing that you show very detailed and source-based in your study. And I see it mirrors experiences here in Germany among the Christian or post-Christian society. So what you showed for the Orthodox Jewish and Roman Catholic tradition is valid for my Protestant tradition as well, I believe. So while reading the book, I encountered some déjà vu moments. And of course, different and even controversial interpretations and conclusions are drawn from the very same sources in the same way in Protestantism, as you showed for Judaism and Roman Catholic theology. For instance, if it comes to the questions whether or not Jews need to acknowledge Jesus as their Messiah in order to be rescued, whether or not there's a need to evangelize Jews in our times, whether or not Martin Luther is one of the historical masterminds of modern anti-Semitism, whether or not the Old Testament has the same theological dignity for Christians than the New Testament, and so forth. In this regard, I very much appreciated your reading of both Roman Catholic and Orthodox Jewish sources as a sobering lecture. Things have improved. There's progress, but history's long shadow has an impact on both Christian and Jews, even beyond the Roman Catholic Church and the Jewish Orthodoxy, I believe. Beyond these analogies and communalities, there are structural asymmetries between the Roman Catholic and the Protestant churches. We have different understandings of hierarchies and the ministries within the church. We don't have a papal magisterium, we don't have a Vatican Council, we don't have a single church that covers the whole planet. Our bishops are speakers who represent the church in public, but they are only one element among others in governing the church. We have state church declarations, we have national church declarations, we even have international church declarations, but we don't have comparable authorities. That leads to the problem that in Protestantism, we tend to not to read and pay attention to what earlier generations have written. Besides our Protestant heroes and saints like, for instance, Luther, Calvin, Schleiermacher, Bonhoeffer, to mention just a few. Therefore, we did not have our Nostra Aetate moment. We don't have a comparable declaration that is available in various languages and that is not even, in theory, globally authoritative. We have a huge amount of declarations, some of them even bold and splendid. But if I look at the declarations of the German churches only, many of them are not even available in English. You point to the fact that Nostra Aetate is a rather brief document, easily accessible in various languages, authoritative. It doesn't take much time to read it. That surely helps too. In 1975, 1991 and 2001, the Evangelische Kirche in Deutschland published 3 studies, Christen und Juden. On the one hand, they map the necessity and the way to renewed Jewish-Christian relations and to theological revisions. On the other hand, the studies themselves illustrate the process that the Protestant churches in Germany went through in these 26 years. But the studies became longer and longer. Who reads them besides those who have committed themselves to dialogue, repentance, and renewal? A similar problem occurred with a fundamental declaration called Church in Israel, which covers various aspects of theological rethinking and repenting from old patterns of prejudice, as well as renewed Jewish-Christian relations. It includes both fundamental theological consideration and practical recommendations. This declaration was adopted by the General Assembly in 2001 by the Communion of Protestant Churches in Europe, CPCE, as Leuenberg document number 6. It is considered, I quote, the first endeavor by European Reformation churches to define a common position on the relationship between Christians and Jews. The CPCE currently has 95 Protestant member churches in Europe, from Portugal to Russia and from Iceland to Greece. Therefore, actually, it could have been our European Protestant Nostra Aetate moment to take the dialogue to a new level. It was published in German and English and accessible at least for the representatives of the member churches. But this document is hardly known and has been read probably even less. Therefore, it was republished just 2 years ago with some accompanying notes and essays. But the problem remains the same. The document has almost 70 pages. It does not have a short summary of central ideas or an abstract that could have been made accessible in the languages of all member churches. The study, Church Membership and Political Culture, commissioned by the EKD, in 2016 came to the conclusion that the EKD positions on issues of Judaism are largely unknown among the respondents. The final report sums up, I quote, "The fact that the EKD positions play practically no role here indicates an insufficient connectivity of the higher church levels." End quote. This applies to lengthy international study documents as well, I think. This shows in a nutshell one of the problems that we face within the churches of the Reformation. Our documents often are not easily accessible, both because of missing translation and briefness. And due to the lack of central and ultimate authorities, which actually is a treasure in my eyes, there seems to be little commitment to make declarations accessible. So we as Protestants speak even less with one voice than the Roman Catholic Church. You show very clearly the wide range, even within Roman Catholic and Jewish Orthodox communities that commit themselves to their respective tradition, probably stronger than we do in Protestant churches. So authority is confronted with personal convictions and experiences to the representatives of these communities too, not only in Protestantism. In all of our respective communities, there are inertial forces that are confronted with various challenges of the theological, political, and sociological changes in our time. If it comes to the particular Jewish-Christian relations, there are still strong skeptical voices that must not be ignored. You showed it brilliantly. I think now we have the opportunity to read and to listen to those voices. Therefore, your book was in a double way sobering lecture to me. It let me see things more clearly. I'm grateful about the achievements of the dialogue. You showed that there are some precious changes that must not be underestimated. But you showed as well there's still a lot to do on either side. Despite my positive experiences with Jews and Christians of various backgrounds, from Haredi Jewish to most liberal cultural Protestant, there is still hostility, discomfort, contempt, disappointment, fear, ignorance, resentment, theological rigidity, traumata, supersessionism, and other traditional reservations. These are reality on either side. And maybe it cannot be any other way. We have, you mentioned it before, I would say 1,500 years of alienation and at best 75 years of rapprochement. I would still say after my reading, the contempt of some Jewish thinkers towards Christian faith is painful to me. But as a historian, I think of the pain that was caused by contempt and hatred by by Christians toward Jews and their Jewish lifestyle. The argument that we as Christians are changing our attitude needs more proof and more resonance among Christians in general, especially under the conditions of the various crises that we are experiencing today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Axel, and thank you again, Christian. Karma, I think now I will offer you some time, if you want, to respond to some of the things that we heard. You don't have to relate to every point, but it's your moment if you want to add something or to address whatever points you see fit before I will open the discussion. And before giving you this time, I would just add another question of my own that you can choose to answer or not. What we hear, I think, in different ways from both from Christian and from Axel is how the question of the Jewish-Christian relation or Jewish-Christian dialogue or whatever you want to call it is in many ways also an inner question within the different communities, the different Christian communities, and as your book shows, also within Jewish communities themselves. So there is, in many ways, a lot of projections, a lot of relations that are taking place with some fantasy or some figure of an other that in many ways reflects inner tensions. And hearing you, I would like to ask you, maybe you can refer to the question of what about non-Christian Judaism, namely Judaism that did not develop, did not grow in Christian, historically in Christian cultures. And of course, I'm referring first and foremost to Jewish communities and traditions that were developed in the Islamic world, in Arab countries, in the East, so to speak. And the question becomes, I think, even more interesting because one of the protagonists that you are talking about and was mentioned here, Manitou, Ashkenazi, who is not Ashkenazi, who is an Algerian Jew, and who plays a very important role in this portrayal of, so to speak, a Jewish polemic against Christianity, is coming from himself, from a non-Christian, from an Islamic culture. So how does this play in general? How do we find ourselves precisely in a situation where precisely a Sephardi Algerian Jew is a protagonist of a polemic against Christianity, and what kind of an inner Ashkenazi Sephardi tension might we see here, what kind of projections and so forth. But that's just one reflection that I add to the list, and now I offer you the time to respond to whatever you want.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. It's really a privilege, and I hope I can frame some things, because I have many things, of course, to discuss with you, but I will start with just 2 points that also relates to what you asked, Elad. Okay, so it really connects well, because one of the things that is coming up in both of your reflections is really the question how to deal with dialogue when it's not only about dialogue. Sometimes it's even not at all, perhaps, about dialogue, but really an internal question. And we see that this occurs in both communities, and that somehow, I think in the Christian contexts, both the Protestant and the Catholic context, it's very clear that Jews are not only external partners, they're also within. And there is another John Paul II quotation with this regard, right, that it's both internal and external, and how do you negotiate exactly this? Some call it the rhetorical Jew, or the Denkfigur, right, the Jew that is within with the one that is without, and they don't always connect. So these lengthy declarations, perhaps, are more about doing this inner work, which is extremely important, but it also, then there is a question of implementation and what you do with non-theologians and how you deal with that, and authority. And it's interesting that in this regard, I think the Protestant world also really wants to speak in one voice, and it's very hard.
It's not in our DNA.
Yeah, but I think it's actually at this point it's in neither of our DNAs, as is very clear that the relation to the other is really polemicized within the community, even within the Orthodox community. So I'm not even talking about the Jewish community, but you can break it down to very little circles, which makes it very interesting, because when we think about the other, we actually think about ourselves, who we are, right? So the projections start with the fact. And I think what the discovery for me was that there is this rhetorical Christian within Judaism as well, or various rhetorical Christians. They can function in different ways sometimes, and they can help us negotiate. And actually, yeah, what we see, the polarization that we see now in Israel also contains something about that. We can maybe talk about it later. But and this also relates to something one of the most interesting things I experienced in my time here in Berlin was, I won't mention who exactly said that, but some authoritative Jewish figure once said, I think it was in the Jewish Berlin course, so those of you who were there may remember, something about Israeli or expats or ex-Israelis that are living here in Berlin. And what she said was that they can be extremely anti-Zionist and anti-Israel. There is a big community here that is very critical towards Israeli policies, etc. But there is one thing that they take from Zionism, and this is the negation of diaspora. So this brings us back exactly to the center of intellectual diaspora, right? What does it mean to negate? Of course, the Zionist idea was that the exilic, the diaspora and exile are of course, brought together in Zionist thought. And there is something very central to the Zionist point of view, that Israel was supposed to solve the problem of exile, of Jewish exile, of the diaspora, and therefore those who are living outside of Israel somehow reflect a past, which is a very Augustinian concept, right? They continue to preserve some kind of a past and to remind us Israelis what we were before and we no longer are. And this is a huge tension within Judaism, which was very, very clear to me when I was here. And one of the aspects, I think the central aspects of this tension is that Israeli Jews don't have the experience of, well, to put it very blatantly, we can call it anti-Semitism, though it doesn't have to be anti necessarily, but we have this experience of an external projection on the Jew that we have here in Europe, I think more than in the United States, but we have it also in the United States in different aspects, and it changes the experience very significantly. And this also brings me to something that Christian said that I want to amend a little bit, because it's a wrong impression, I think, that the book gives, that actually Judaism is very negative towards Christianity, and now it can be finally surfaced and expressed. And of course, we're talking about religious traditions. They have parts which are extremely hostile to other religions, right? Religions weren't always very excellent in respecting others that do not respect their truth claims. It's not something that, so we should take the context into account. So of course there are anti-Gentile, anti-Christian streams within Judaism, and we'll go back to the Muslim context later. But this is not the only source, right? There is a polyphony of sources also within Judaism.
And also within Israel, you show it very clearly. So you have the Orthodox, then the National Orthodox.
Religious Zionism,
religious Zionism.
Right.
So it's very differentiated.
Yeah. So there is, of course, there is a corpus of sources, and it has characteristics that go in certain directions, but each community can pull the strings that she wants to pull from these, that it wants to pull from tradition, which can be very different. So in a way, there is something very new about this antagonism that comes up, even though that the Orthodox communities, which are very antagonistic towards Christianity, would like to present it as eternal truths, of course. We were always very antagonistic, very negative with regards to Christianity, but only now, but our ancestors had to play the game because they were a minority under Christian oppression. I don't think this is actually the case. I think this is something that is coming up now, and this brings us to another central question that you ask. As Christians, what do we do with Jewish resentment? What do we do with Jewish rage? And I think in the European context, this is not addressed very often, even though there is something, when we think about it from a distance, for a moment, it's quite clear that there will be these sort of, right? Resentment is not something that, I mean, it's imaginable, and somehow it didn't have so much room, I think, in the realm of dialogue. This is also, I'm wondering why did Jewish authors didn't give it more room, and some Jewish authors did, actually, but that's another story. And maybe to put it even more clearly, how this is somehow, it seems to me that the great danger here is that if Jews can be hostile towards Christianity, this means that all kinds of anti-Semitic ideas that were very prevalent within Christian traditions are validated. Because, right, anti-Judaism was very often about the Jews are always hostile towards Christianity, they are the enemies of Christ, of Christians, etc. And now we see that those Jews really say very hard things. So my editor once said, and this was, I think, very brilliant, that when we talk about sexual harassment, for example, it doesn't matter how the person you harass is dressed. Right? It's not about this person's behavior. So in a way, I think this is a good reframing, of this question. But this is hard. So how do we put together both anti-Judaism and anti-Christianity without kind of bringing back the bad projections, but somehow dealing with these things together. And in the contemporary discourse, I think Israel is really the center where things pop up very, very strongly. But it's not that it doesn't exist in other places. We see there, and I think today it's much more overt than it was when I wrote the book. This anti-Christian discourse is very much surfaced. So how we deal with both of these discourses together, right? So that's one point that I wanted to discuss. And then let's okay. So I have a few ideas on your point, and maybe I'll say something about Ashkenazi, who interestingly comes up here. So there is one chapter in the book that deals with a contemporary religious Zionist discourse. It's actually not even religious Zionist, it's a very specific circle, but this is the theological circle, so to say, in this Orthodox world, which usually works much more with halakha. And there we have really something like theology, and very much also resonates with Christian theology, right? Ashkenazi was an Algerian Jew working in France, then moving to Israel, becoming extremely Zionist, and mixing so many experiences together. A very fascinating figure who's incredibly polemical towards Christians and Christianity. And his students, his disciples, very often know nothing about Christianity, but they take some of his ideas, and he did have some kind of knowledge also of the contemporary setting and of the dialogue. So this is a very small circle, but it evokes a lot of attention. This is also the circle where the most overt hostile Orthodox circle. So it's also very emotional, I think, this specific chapter. And this Ashkenazi, Manitou, is also writing a little about Islam. And so I would like to even broaden your question. It's not only about what about Jews that come from non-Christian societies, it's also what about Muslims, right? It's or non-Christians or others who are not Christians and also have a stake there in terms of Jewish thought and trajectory and how this relates to the book. So I would say, in terms of Ashkenazi, that it has a double function. First of all, and this we see a lot in religious Zionist discourse, Muslims, and this is a very traditional thing, are less of a problem for Jewish Orthodox thought. For halachic reasons, traditional reasons, also because Maimonides was very appreciative of Muslim philosophy, and actually the Jewish take on Jewish-Christian polemic comes from, it's an inheritance from the Muslim world, because Jews worked in a Muslim context where Muslims were polemicizing with Christians, exactly. So Jews had something to take from the Muslim world in this regard and import it to the Western context where they could polemicize with Christians themselves. So there is a lot of similarity in something that really brings together Judaism and Islam against the third tradition, which is very interesting because today we see, of course, less of Jewish-Muslim dialogue, and the Judeo-Christian prism really took the stage, which is very interesting because there are reasons to think that it should be this should not necessarily be the case. But this also means, and I think it's true also, it's very true in Israel, that there is still an obsession with the West, very much an obsession with the West, and that Zionist thought also imports, and these things that I learned from you and from others, I'm thinking about Nono, for example, and Gila Nijal, that we have also aspects in Zionist thought that identify with the Orientalist gaze, which is very close to the Christian anti-Jewish gaze, and it internalizes it and turns it against Islam. So in a way, it both takes Islamic tradition against Christianity and Christian tradition against Islam at one and the same time, which I find extremely interesting. So perhaps not too optimistic, but still extremely interesting. So, right. So this is, I think this is what I have to say at this point. But there are many other things that I should think further about. So we should talk. Yeah.
So maybe that will be a good moment to open the discussion.
Christian wants to say something? Or
Unless, Axel or Christian, you want to react to the reaction?
Go, open.
Okay, so I will open the discussion and invite you to offer your questions, remarks, contributions, whatever nature there are. Please.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much. It was great, a great discussion, and thank you very much to be here. All the time that I'm here and hearing you, I was remember about a kind of congress we had during the time of Abraham show in Jewish Museum in Berlin. It was a dialogue between Christians, Jews, and Muslims about Abraham. And I'm not German, I'm not American, and I'm not from Israel. I'm from São Paulo, Brazil. Then I cannot understand the world, sorry, really. I cannot understand as I am, as from my tradition. We used to live together and we used to share our experience, even though in religions. And because of this, I ask you now, at the moment in Israel, the dialogue between the three religions are going on a way of polarization, or is possible to see a dialogue as we saw in Vilnius with Pope Francis, Rabbi, and the Muslim praying together and working together in the city in the hope to have a reconciliation. That's my question. Now, this moment with the crisis we have and with the new meaning of anti-Semitism and so on.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I think it's very relevant for the discussion. Well, we can start by saying that there is very little interreligious dialogue in Israel in the way that we understand dialogue here and in the United States. We have something else. First of all, I think because, and this is apropos non-Christian ideas that are still present in this Middle Eastern realm, there is no consensus with regards to what Judaism means, what Islam means. Is it exactly religion? Is it something else? It's harder to extract the religious component from these civilizational settings. And of course, everything is political. And I think here there is really an attempt to depoliticize Jewish-Christian dialogue. I'm not sure it's extremely successful necessarily, but for sure this is it's part of the Christian initiative as we see it in many realms, not in the United States, by the way. In the United States, it does function politically for various political agendas, but I think here the attempt is to, and certainly the Vatican's attempt is to depoliticize Jewish-Christian dialogue. Even in Nostra Aetate, for example, this, right? How is the Jewish people called in Nostra Aetate? It's called the seed of Abraham. Yeah. The word Israel is not there, and it's very clear why it is not there in 65.
And in Vatican documents, you don't speak about the Jewish people, so that's not a subject. So it's Judaism. So it's just Judaism defined as a religion in the sense, or in an analogous way as Christianity, but the Jewish people as subject and entity is not the dialogue partner finally.
Excellent. So So in a way, you may say, because it can be, as people who believe in dialogue, we may be a bit critical, perhaps, to the fact that there is no such thing exactly, and there is a lot of political tension between the communities. It's very strong. The Christian community is suffering a lot. The Muslim and Jewish rivalry, there is no need to say too many words about it, because we all know it very well. But on the other hand, we can also say that there is something that does not submit itself to the specific categories that Jewish-Christian dialogue in the Western context imply, which is also perhaps an expression of liberation from this perspective. This is another thing that was very present for me in my time here, that when we talk about Jewish-Christian dialogue, even the definition already tells us which Jews will be in and which will not, right? Because this religious spectrum means, for example, that secular Jews will not have any investment in such a dialogue, which is a problem, right? So there is, I think this is the reason.
Thank you very much, Karma, for the presentation, and thank you for the speakers. I would like to have two questions. First, indeed, regarding what is currently experienced in Jerusalem, which I think caught even many Orthodox unprepared. I mean, the violence against Christian communities. And it seemed perhaps that is slightly against one of the things you said. It seems that it comes also from the anti-Zionist Orthodox community. So it's not just a Zionist gaze that perhaps wants to reassert itself vis-a-vis Christianity, but also Orthodox communities which are quite skeptical still feel the need to be against Christianity. And I wonder, how do you read that, and in which sense your book helps to comprehend and even to go perhaps into some sort of solutions with regard to what is experienced in Jerusalem now?
Thanks, Itamar. It was so hard for me to concentrate just because I'm so happy to see you and to hear you. But let's see what I can do with your question notwithstanding. So, yeah, maybe we are actually, it's a very good point, because we seem to talk a little bit about Zionism, making Zionism into the monster that prevents us from reconciliation, which is totally not the case, the way I see it. And also Zionism has multiple voices in itself with regards to Jewish-Christian dialogue, to all kinds of initiatives. So that's a very good point. And there is something new, or something that is surfacing, I think, in Israel both with regards to what we call Zionism and what is not Zionism, and the connection between anti-Zionist or a-Zionist Orthodox communities and those who see themselves as Zionists, and also secular Zionists. As you know, these flags that are returning, they have the return of the suppressed somehow now in the demonstrations that signifies many different things. So Zionism does signify many different things. And the problems that Judaism has with Christianity do not start with Zionism. And of course, Haredi Judaism also inherits some of it, some of these issues, and actually even highly intellectual circles that support Jewish-Muslim dialogue, for example, would be anti-Zionist precisely because Christianity tends to be Zionist today. So it's very complicated. It's very complicated as well. I'm not sure I have a solution. I don't know what you implied exactly. But I do think that this So what's happening with the Christian community in the land of Israel and in the state of Israel is really deplorable, and it's getting worse for sure. And but I do think this can be, and it's important to contextualize it as exactly when we try to acknowledge that the problems of these two communities, the entanglement between them, continues. And maybe to say one more thing, I listened to a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi, that wants to encourage Orthodox, especially Haredi, people not to spit on churches and on Christians in the old city. And what he says, and that's very interesting, is that the thing that is most disturbing for those Jews who want to spit on Christians when they see, and it's usually either Catholics or Orthodox or Armenian, right, that are dressed.
Monks also, they are dressed
exactly. It's really the religious that are, because it's very clear that, right, they're Christian belongings. But it's exactly those communities who do not missionize that they spit on, while what's really disturbing them is Christian mission. So Messianic Jews, for example, is the enemy of those who resent Christians there, but the missionaries are not identifiable, and usually they are Western. So once again, we have this. It's mostly the non-Western Christians who get the
heats.
Who get the heats, right? While it's very much about the conflicts that Jews have with their Western pasts or present, right, so to say. So, yeah, I hope this does something.
I saw here a question, and I saw someone there. Before that, I just want to add a little remark to the question of, as you say, whether Zionism stands in the way of the dialogue. I think since we do have here a Catholic and Protestant voice, it's interesting to reflect on an ongoing debate on, to what exactly do we owe Zionism? And some Jewish voices, for example, Nono, who was here a few months ago, who presented the thesis, which is not only his own. He voiced the thesis exists. In what way Zionism is a Protestant modernity, and there are different ways of expressing that. One of them, right, is the return to the Bible. And so forth and so forth, the idea of the national religion. And I wonder if we have here, in your book, the focus on the Catholic indeed shows very much in what way the State of Israel and Zionism creates problems for the will of the Church, of the Catholic Church, or so to speak, of reconcile with Judaism that becomes nationalistic and so forth. So I wonder if here there is a different story, profoundly different story vis-a-vis the Protestant communities. That's just.
I didn't understand the connection.
If Zionism stands in the way when it comes to Catholicism,
right,
but maybe vis-a-vis
maybe less vis-a-vis
Protestant Christianity, there is a huge, in America, a huge support of Zionism by evangelical churches. So this is a very different story, perhaps.
I just want to add another aspect. When we are talking now on dialogue, I have always the impression we need the other in order to construct our own identity. And how does it work? And now within Zionism, if the religious national Zionism says diaspora existence, Jewish diaspora existence, is always shaped and molded and permeated by Christianity, how do you create a diaspora Jewish identity beyond Christian influence, or how does it, and how is the othering from the Zionists in the country towards the diaspora and the other way around? Because I have always now the impression that as Christians, I'm also one of the partners in constructing Jewish identity. So, in this context again.
Well, I was educated as a Protestant, but I wouldn't call myself religious. And I think this is, of course, not all the time about religion, but a lot about politics, and that's obvious. And I wanted to come back to what you said in the beginning about the value of disagreement. I was a historic buildings conservator. I had a lot to do with disagreements. So I invented the term of the value of disagreement, Streitwert. But this supposes that people are equal and that they are on the same level of competence and of willingness to communicate and of power. And this is not necessarily the case. So this is why I would like to somehow open up the discussion between different religions. It's Jewish or Christian also, but it's all, so let us say, it is very European and old-fashioned European. And it may be perhaps very white, I don't know. I don't really deal with these black and white discourses. But I think the other dimensions would be interesting to integrate in the debate because listening to all your very wise words, and I want to read your book, the terms are always, to describe a collective, it's always the religious term. And this might be somehow not sufficient.
And not? So the religious term and not? What kind of language would you...
Well, because...
language? Like a liberal egalitarian language?
I wouldn't call myself or wouldn't identify with Christianity only, but with democracy and human rights. And this is beyond religion. Of course, religion is part of it, but it's part of a larger tableau of the world. And I would like to somehow go on with let us say, models of comprehension and of dissensus. That you could just, I mean, it's difficult for some people to live with dissents because they want to be on the right side. And there are not two sides, but it's very obvious that this wouldn't work. But I should stop here.
No, that's a very good intervention. I think for a few reasons. First of all, one of the conclusions of the book is precisely that religion makes things very complicated, but on a more, maybe we can call it universalistic, or even let's not even go there, but on the everyday level, when you don't get into theological questions, then there are various new aspects of interaction and negotiation between Jews and Christians, and sometimes it's not important who's Jewish and who's Christian. And let's even say something that is perhaps obvious. I think that the religious divides are much weaker today than the political divides. For example, if it's easier that a Jewish liberal will have much more in common with a Muslim liberal and a Christian liberal than they will have with somebody that is conservative from their own community. This is where the drama is today, much more than... so that's true, for sure. I think what makes theology so interesting is precisely that it brings in difference. And perhaps unlike you, I don't think that difference is something of the past. I think it's actually coming back in very... So identity politics is very much about difference, and decolonization and post-colonialism is very much about these things. And these things are very strong. I think the political polarization that we see in so many places in the world is precisely because all this liberal democracy heritage is also a very white, old, and Western thing. This is something that we see, perhaps unfortunately, but the discourse somehow has its way to reincarnate in various venues, and to bring back things that are parts of our tradition, and very often they are encapsulated in religious traditions, precisely, and again, because religion was not always only about religion. It was simply our history in many ways, and our history still has a very strong function in shaping contemporary identities as well. And this actually connects with your last comments and perhaps with your conversation about the possibility of having this dialogue on an equal basis with Jews that are not shaped by the Christian gaze. So I'm not sure that I believe in a Judaism that is not shaped by the Christian gaze or other sort of...
by another.
Or by another, exactly.
Exactly. So
exactly.
In the Muslim context, it could be
as well,
another, but
absolutely.
it's shaped by the other.
And this attempt to extract something from the from this power of structure seems to me extremely difficult, and perhaps it's actually good to not to assume that this should be our goal, perhaps. Right. So yeah. So I think just also to say something about Protestantism, and it seems to me that sometimes Protestantism is really essentialized, which doesn't make sense to this incredibly diverse world, also in terms of how to formulate the connection between religion and politics. This is really not, yeah, so this is just, it seems to me that this affinity to the Catholic world, which tends to be less Zionist, perhaps, and now I'm talking about those who are very critical towards Zionism, such as...
No,
for example. Yeah, the line of thought, thread of thought. Right, that there is, that the influence from the Catholic world is also very, very strong. Yeah, and this also goes in diverse ways that are both Zionist and anti-Zionist, both Christian and anti-Christian. And these things really go together, and you have to, every time, to really put the needle in the very specific context and power structure and language, and, you know, that's only, yeah, that's my point.
Maybe may I add just one sentence? I think it depends on what Protestantism you are talking about. I mean, there's even in Germany, there is, well, a long tradition of anti, or at least, let me say, Zionist skeptical tradition. So if you're talking about North American or South American evangelical or Pentecostal Protestantism, of course, you may have more Zionist elements than you would have it in the, well, here in Europe, for example. Just.
If I may, thank you for your talk. Thank you for your book, which I'm going to read. What my observation of our entire exchange tonight is that I think the very notion of dialogue presupposes the existence of two individuals, of two selves, of two beings. And that automatically raises the questions, who am I? Who is the other? And is who I am not in a way also defined by the very difference that exists between me and the other? And then very quickly, I think we leave this, and very quickly leave the sphere of religion, of theology. It becomes a sociological topic, a historical topic. And I mean, since we are here in Berlin, where music plays such an important role, you could also look into music. You could look into the music of Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, who brought Bach back to our world. So basically what I'm saying is you should have ideas from many more books, and I'm really looking forward to reading those too.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you.
There's a question over there.
Thank you. I have so many questions, but I'm going to ask just two. Do you also look at the phenomenon of anti-Semitic philo-Semitism, so forms of like patronization or appropriation or identification? And I was just looking up that the original title translated from the Hebrew was this pottage of lentils, and I was wondering if you could speak to that. And I was also intrigued, but I think maybe you answered this in the way that you showed that Christianity is dominated in this dialogue, if I'm understanding correctly, that you put Christian before Jewish, in Christian Jewish, both in the original title and in the translation. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I think philo-Semitism, first of all, Elad is the person who wrote a book on anti-Semitism, so he's the real expert, seriously. But I'm very interested in this concept, and there is this huge, or actually various debates about the definition of anti-Semitism and what is included there, and what is the place of philo-Semitism within this definition, which is really fascinating. I think even more than the finding the definition is fascinating, it's just fascinating to reflect on this discourse and to what extent this brings about so many really fascinating things. Also the secular religious divide, for example. So there is the important sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, for example, who talks about allo-Semitism. So it's something that brings, a concept that brings together all sorts of projections on Jews and Judaism, and not only the anti, because there is a much more complex dynamic. So the whole point of setting the Jews apart, even if it's in a positive way, is problematic in his perception. And I think there are many who share this, both Jews and non-Jews, who share this notion even without using the term that he suggests. And this really brings together, in a way, anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism. But from a Christian perspective, especially when we know Jewish-Christian dialogue and the way it evolved after the Holocaust, the most anti-Semitic thing you can do is deny the election of Israel, of the Jewish people. In other words, it's the setting of Jews apart, which is, you know, the way to struggle against anti-Semitism is precisely by acknowledging that the Jews are set apart, they're set apart by God. So we have exactly the opposite perception of what anti-Semitism even means, right? Which is very much in line with some kind of a secular or non-religious and religious divide, which I find really fascinating, the way that these things function against each other. Even when we talk about anti-Semitism, we don't really know, or we're not sure what exactly are we talking about. So that's, right? So that's one thing. And about the Hebrew title, Nazid Adashim, a pottage of lentils, which also refers to this Jacob-Esau relationship, but this is a very Old Testament term, which I actually like very much and is very well known in Jewish communities. But I think the hesitation of the publisher, which is also, it's really fascinating to hear, is that that Old Testament images won't how do you say? What?
Won't sell.
Won't sell, exactly. So that you need something a bit more, yeah. It's so nobody, right? So in the beyond the Hebrew speaking discourse or the Jewish discourse, perhaps it's even it's a global thing. A pottage of lentil, there are only various circles, certain circles that it might ring a bell to them. So this was how, which is again very interesting, which religious images that basically traditions share with each other, right? The Jewish and the Christian traditions share, but in certain contexts they evoke a lot of imagination and they really bring you in, and in other contexts they are alien and they don't do anything. So that's a very interesting thing in its own in its own right. And what was your last point about the Hebrew and the...
That you put Christian before Jewish, but I think also using Jacob has Israel, right, in the subtext, because Jacob becomes Israel.
It becomes Israel, but again, it depends, because when we talk about typological traditions, and of course it's a negotiation where these typological traditions start, but of course we have something like this in Paul already, no matter what Paul really speaks to, and this is a different debate. It's a question, right? So both communities think that they are Jacob. It's not necessarily Israel. This is what the competition is about. And of course, the Christians had a much better case than the Jews, because the Jews were there first. But we see in rabbinic literature how midrashim, how rabbis are trying to actually to put themselves to put the Jewish community as the one that came after, that came later. So that's not, it shouldn't be, I think today you're right, that Jacob means Israel, but it's not, traditionally speaking, it wasn't a consensus at all.
But when we speak on your Hebrew book, can you say about something about the reception of your book in Israel? How are the reactions?
I think it was received well in Hebrew, because there are no secrets in the Hebrew-speaking community, and the Orthodox secular divide, because we don't have so many conservative and Reform communities. It's really about non-religious and Orthodox. So everything is somehow either or both Orthodox and non-religious in a certain sense. But we know this discourse, I think, better. So it was easy. It was received quite well, at least in the academic communities. In the Orthodox communities, it was a little more difficult, because for liberal Orthodox communities, maybe liberal is not even the good word for that, but those who really want to promote Jewish-Christian dialogue, there was something also painful in what we call surfacing the dirty laundry. This is usually the discourse, right? And because there are multiple voices, and in some sense that I didn't reflect them well enough, and I think it was very much correct in terms of the Hebrew version. This is something that I tried to do in the English version. Perhaps I should have tried even more, but this was really the effort of contextualization, especially when we think about a more global audience. That the diversity of voices had to be there, because these things are so sensitive. It's not only a scholarly matter. These people's hearts are invested in it, and this is something that in the religious studies secular perspective in Israel I wasn't enough aware of, and this is something that I really very much learned here. So the reception was more or less well, and the best surprise is that today there are many Orthodox rabbis who actually find interest in dialogue, especially with Catholics, by the way, because of the German, because it's much less accessible, the Protestant materials. And this is, I think it's a new thing, and a very interesting new thing, because rabbis are very often theologians, and they are really thirsty for some good theology, and suddenly they discover it in an unpredictable place, and it raises a lot of interest. So I have all kinds of interesting interactions, and this is a new audience that is now open, and I think it's really fascinating. So yeah, okay.
Karma, I'm sure after tonight you'll have a lot of new audience, and the sales of the book will rocket. We will continue this conversation outside. There is wine and pretzels, so please do stay to continue the conversation. And before that, help me to thank Karma and Christian and Axel for this wonderful conversation. And me.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure. תודה רבה.
Good evening.